Good day, AP Calcers. So today we are going to go through the mini quiz from 5.4, and that is where we have this graph of F, and it tells us that the regions A, B, C, D, and E have areas. So I'm going to just label it on the graph because I like to be a little bit more of a visual. So we've got 2, we've got 14, and we've got 10, we've got 27, and we have E is 4. All right, let me get rid of that random scribble. And what I'm going to do is with the ones that are below the x-axis, I hope you guys all know what I'm going to be doing, making them negative. All right. So now that I have my areas labeled, I can kind of go about and look at what is the question asking of me. So we've got g of x equals 8 plus the integral from -5 to x of f of t dt. So is there a value? Oh, as soon as I say that starting off sentence, I'm like, oh, that's a theorem. They're asking me about a theorem, either the MVT or an IVT. Now, is there a value between -5 and -1 such that g of x equals 0? Well, first thing I'm thinking is it's probably the IVT because the MVT would be g prime. So first thing I do is I have to find, well, they gave us -5 and -1. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find what is g of -5 equal to, and then I'm going to find what does g of -1 equal to. And then I can kind of look at that and kind of see where am I going with my analysis. So if I plug in -5 into the g function, I get 8 plus the integral from -5 to -5 of f of t dt. So that's going to equal 8 plus the integral, the area under the curve from -5 to -5, that's 0. So g of -5 is 8. Now we do g of -1. G of -1 is going to equal 8 plus the integral from -5 to -1 of f of t dt. So that equals 8 plus, and then we do the area under the curve from -5 to -1, which is -10. So 8 plus a -10. So we get g of -1 is equal to -2. And if g of -5 is equal to 8, well, g of -5 equals 8. G of -1 equals -2. Could we say that g of x equals 0? Yes, we can, because 0 is in between our two values of -2 and 8. So therefore, g of x is going to equal 0 because 0 is between -2 and 8, and we just showed that g of -5, if it goes from from 8 to -2, then it does. So we would say yes, because of the IVT. And then we could say 0 is between -2 and 8, which are the values for g of -1 and g of -5. I'm running out of room. Okay, on to the next one. Find the absolute minimum and absolute maximum. I hope you guys are being like, oh, two things. Those two things are CPs and EPs. So we've got to check our critical points and our endpoints of G because it's saying the max and min values of G. So we need the endpoints of G. So that's going to be G of -11 and G of 7. And then we need the CPs of G. So when we do the derivative of G, that's going to be G prime equals F. So this is a graph of F. It's also the graph of G prime. So I'm looking for, where does the graph of G prime, where does G prime equal 0? Negative 11, but that's an endpoint. Negative 9, so I'm going to want G of negative 9. Negative 5, so I'm going to want G of negative 5. Negative 1, so I'm going to want G of negative 1. And G of 5. But because at 5 it goes from a positive to a positive, it's going to be neither a relative maximum nor a relative minimum. So do we need to check that to see if it's an absolute max or absolute min? No, you don't need to. So you don't need to waste your time with 5. If you want, you can do G of 5, but it's going to give you no value that would be an absolute max or an absolute min. Okay? All right, so we've got G of negative 11. So we do 8 plus the integral from negative 5 to negative 11. So if we start at negative 5 and we go to negative 11, that's going backwards. So we're going to switch those signs. So we've got 8 plus negative 14 plus 2. So I'm going to just list this over here. G of negative 11 equals negative 4. Okay, then we've got G of 7. So we've got 8 plus the integral from negative 5 to 7. So we go 8 plus, and then we go from negative 5 all the way to 7. So we've got negative 10 plus 27 plus 4. All right. So we've got 8 plus negative 10, that's negative 2, plus 27, that's 25. 25 plus 4 is 29. So G of 7 is 29. All right, then we keep going. G of negative 9 is going to equal 8 plus the integral from negative 5 to negative 9. So we're traveling once again backwards. So we're going to do 8 plus a negative 14. So we've got G of negative 9 equals negative 6. All right, now G of negative 5 we just found up above, which was 8. So G of negative 5 equals 8. And G of negative 1 we found up above, which was negative 2. So G of negative 1 equals negative 2. All right, now we want to find the absolute max and absolute min. So I look at my Y values. My absolute minimum is negative 6. My absolute max is, I look at my Y values, 29. And that is my final solution. What's my justification of my answer? Well, I check my CPs and EPs. 29 is the maximum, negative 6 is the minimum. And that's it.